Hello again, this is Dr. Robert Guthrie. We're continuing our Sunday School Bible study on the New Testament. That's a continuation from the class at Jerome United Methodist Church, which got pushed out into a virtual situation by the pandemic, as we all know. We're doing the second part of Luke. We'll do Luke in 4 sections. Second part now, which is chapters 7 through 12. And a number of the stories were actually very similar because, as we know, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, the Synoptic Gospels, share sources, probably 2 sources, and you'll find some overlap between the stories. So I may touch on them a little bit less than previous times and try to emphasize certain of these stories are unique to Luke. We begin with the cure of the centurion's servant. As you remember, centurion sends a message to Jesus, "Could you please cure my servant?" And Jesus says, "Okay, I'll come." And the centurion says, "No, you don't need to come. I'm under command of people. When they tell me to do something, I do it. When I have people underneath me and I tell them to do it, they do it. You don't need to come. You could just say for him to be healed, and he'll be healed." And he was. And this is a very interesting lesson because this guy's a Gentile. He's not a Hebrew. He's not a Jew. He's a Gentile, but never had Jesus seen such faith that he could heal at a distance as he saw from this Gentile soldier. It's a very interesting story that really emphasizes, the importance of it's not just our close community who can be true believers, it's the whole world. Then there's a unique story about Jesus is coming along, and there's a procession carrying a dead son of a widow lady, and Jesus stops him and touches it and he raises him from the dead. Now, it's very important because, if you're a widow in first century Palestine and you don't have any children to take care of you, you're in desperate straits. There was no welfare system or anything like that to take care of people, and so actually, even though it's a unique story, it's very important. Then in Luke, as the other Gospels, Jesus gets a message from John the Baptist. "Are you the one we were expecting? Are you the Messiah? Or are you just the herald?" And Jesus says, sends back the message, "Tell him what you see. We're raising the dead, we're healing the blind and the deaf, and curing all sorts of illnesses, and tell him what you see." And then he makes it clear that John was the herald that was promised in Isaiah, that someone will come crying in the wilderness to announce the arrival of the Messiah. And Jesus challenges the scribes and Pharisees about John's baptism. He said, "Why didn't you all get baptized by John?" And they don't have an answer, but they're really kind of thinking, "Well, I'm so righteous, why would I need to be baptized?" Well, none of us are that righteous. And I think that's his real bugaboo with the scribes and Pharisees. You're supposed to love everybody, including your adversaries, but they were difficult to love because they were so full of themselves that their own self-righteousness, that they didn't realize they were sinners just like the rest of us, because we all are. Then he's having a meal at a Pharisee's house. Remember, the Pharisees are a community-based movement, like being an evangelical nowadays. They weren't official. There was no training or anything like that. They were just a group that bonded together. And this woman comes in who had a sinful past. It's not clear what her sinful past was, but you can use your own imagination. And she comes in and has oil to anoint his feet and washes them with her tears and wipes them with her hair. And she had a terrible reputation, and the Pharisees are all a twitter that Jesus is letting himself be touched by this sinful woman. And his point is, who's going to be, you all didn't welcome me and offer me anything to clean my feet. And she did with her tears and her hair. And who's going to be more grateful to be forgiven, the greater sinner or the lesser sinner? And this is an important lesson a little bit. If you've ever gone around the Holy Land in sandals like I did, your feet get really gross. And so part of washing the feet was a welcoming ritual in the Holy Land, because it's dusty and dirty and you're wearing sandals. And so there's a lot of hidden meaning in this, but it's a very interesting point. Who's going to be more grateful for being forgiven, this very sinful woman or the self-righteous scribes and Pharisees? So the reason he's on them is because they're way too self-righteous and too full of themselves. Then he gives the parable, which is also in Matthew and Luke about the sower of the sow, the seeds falling on the rocks and in the path, where the birds pick it up in the rocks so they can't get rooted, etc. And that's one we're all familiar with, so I don't need to spend a lot of time on it. Had an interesting situation where his family come up to talk to him, and his followers say, your family's here. He said, but who's really my family? My family is really this group of people that are following me. So it's an interesting, we need to sometimes supplant our own personal family of our relations with the family of the church and the other believers there. And then he has one of my two favorite miracle stories. This is the second of my two favorites. When they're in the boat going across the Sea of Galilee at night, a storm comes up and the boat's about to sink, and they get nervous and they wake him up, and he just says, all right, cool it, to the weather, and the weather stops. And it's a very interesting description of the nature of the divinity of Jesus and of God. The gods of the Middle Eastern religions, the pagan religions, were storm gods and sea gods and moon gods. And all. The gods were representative of the natural forces which are around us all the time. And so, but in the Yahweh faith, in the God and Jesus faith, Jesus is in control of these forces. He's not represented by the wind and the storm and the rain and all that. He's in charge of these things. So there's actually hidden in this little story a true explanation of what the divine presence is like in all our lives. Then you have the Gerasene demoniac story. This is the poor man who's crazy and lives in the tombs, and they try to tie him up, and he breaks the ropes and runs around, and finally, it's interesting how they have, who can recognize Jesus? Most of the people don't, but the demons inside these people, they come up. So what do you want from us, Jesus, Lord of the Most High? And don't send us to the abyss, down to hell. And he said, what do you want me to do with you? He said, well, put us in those pigs. So he sends them to the pigs. Pigs run down the hill and jump in the Sea of Galilee, and they're drowned. So that little touch means, what does that touch mean with that area? Is that a Jewish area? No way. That's a Gentile area because they have pigs. Jewish people wouldn't be allowed to have pigs because of the prohibition against pork. But the real thing is, it's interesting how the demons can recognize Jesus, but many of the regular people don't. I always wonder if Jesus came back now, how many of us would recognize him? Probably not many of us as we really think. We get too full of ourselves. There's another raising of the dead. We raise this Jairus' daughter, and he goes in, and she's lying there deceased. And he said, no, she's not dead. She's just sleeping. So he touches her and gets her up, and they feed her, and everything's fine. Again, raising the dead. And it follows by my favorite miracle story. I'm not certain why it is, but it really is. Where he's walking along in a crowd, and a woman who's had a hemorrhage for 12 years. Now, this is vaginal bleeding for 12 years, dysfunctional uterine bleeding. And when you had that in primitive societies, you were an outcast. The feeling of the menstrual flow was contaminated, and in really primitive societies, they'd have a little tent or an extra building where you'd go while you had your period. So this poor woman has been an outcast for all these years, and she comes up behind him and touches his cloak. And she's healed. Now, she's healed by her faith. You know, if she didn't believe he was going to heal her, it wouldn't have healed. But it's her faith that heals her. But he turns on her because he said my favorite phrase. He felt the power go out of it. It's a fascinating phrase. And you know, he was basically it was your sins are forgiven. Go and don't worry about it. You know. Then he sends the 12 out to the villages around Galilee to minister. And it's very interesting instructions. That we could think about again, that he sends them basically with nothing. In one of the three stories, they could take a staff with them, but none of them could take an extra tunic. They couldn't take any money. They couldn't take any food. They had to depend on the welcoming of the villages. They would heal the sick and teach the lessons, and they would live off the generosity of people in the village. And if they reject you, turn away, leave, and shake the dust from your sandals. Probably slap the sandals to shake the dust of the people that reject him. And they go out and they come back, and they're enjoyed the experience that they had. But it's a good, interesting lesson. One of the several of the Catholic orders in the Middle Ages attempted this, the mendicant begging orders, where they would go with nothing and they would service the poor They would depend on the charity of the community to do that. And that's all gotten lost along the way, that we possibly should be taking that approach to take care of the poor and live with them in that poor. Then they have the Transfiguration, which is an interesting story, complicated. He takes Peter and James and John up to a mountain. I've actually been on the mountain where this probably occurred. It's a beautiful view. And Elijah and Moses are waiting there for him. And Peter's, in his own way, says, we can stay up here. I can make you some houses for the three of us, for the three of you all and all that. And then Jesus says, no, that's not the point. Then a cloud comes down and he glows, and the voice said, "This is my beloved son in whom I'm well pleased," et cetera, et cetera. And then the cloud goes away and it's back to normal Jesus, and they go back. It's a very interesting experience, showing the power of relating to the Almighty in that situation. So it's very, very interesting. Then the next cure is a classic epilepsy. This is a youngster, doesn't say how old, who has, in the description, is clearly of a grand mal epileptic seizure. He falls to the ground, he twitches, he foams at the mouth, and then he's groggy afterward. That's not the term they use, I forget, subdued or something like that. Classic description of a grand mal seizure. True epilepsy. Jesus cures him. So Jesus is able to change the anatomy of the brain or the biochemistry of the brain to cure this person's seizure disorder. Seizure disorders are tough enough to treat even in modern life with our medications, but he's able to change the brain anatomy or biochemistry to cure this. It's a very interesting story if you come from a medical background like I do. Then he's asked, which we've seen in the other accounts, what is the greatest commandment? And he recites from Deuteronomy, to love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, and all your might, and goes to Leviticus, love your neighbor as yourself. And here in this, unique to Luke, they ask him, well, who is your neighbor? Because in the Leviticus, the neighbors were your kinfolk and your tribesmen and your clan and all that, and everybody else was not your neighbor. You didn't have to love them. Here in the New Testament, Jesus clearly expands our love obligation to everybody, not just the people we like or the people we're related to. Sometimes we don't like the people we're related to, but we're stuck with them. That's a different question. But you need to love everybody, and this is where the Good Samaritan comes in. It's a story that is unique to Luke also. And this person's going down the Jerusalem road to Jericho. I've been on that road. Jerusalem's high, about 1,200, 1,400 feet. Jericho's down below sea level, down on the Dead Sea, and he's going down that road. It's unclear where it actually happened. And he was attacked by robbers who beat him and abused him and injured him severely and stole all his stuff. And a priest comes by. The priest looks over at him and goes to the other side of the road apparently and walks down and ignores him. Then a Levite, a teacher of the law, comes and does the same thing. Then a Samaritan comes down. Now remember, the Samaritans were the enemies of the blood of the Hebrews. They both each regarded the other side as a half-breed iconoclast who had corrupted the faith. And so they got along as well as the Protestants and Catholics in Northern Ireland have all through our lifetime. That's the kind of animosity they have toward each other. But the Samaritan stops, bandages his wound, puts oil on him, washes his wounds, takes him to an inn, gives the innkeeper money to take care of him, and he says, if you need more money when I'm on my way home, I'll stop by and give it to you. And Jesus said, who was your neighbor? So here, it's not only that it was a stranger who took care of this person, but a person from an enemy tribe, basically an enemy of the blood, took care of this stranger. So the message is very clear. We're supposed to love everybody, particularly the people we don't like. And that's a challenge on the people we're not comfortable with. So you got to love your political rivals. You've got to love your business rivals. You got to love her. And me, the academic rivals I had inside academic medicine. And these are tough orders, and we really need to work on it. Then you have another interesting story, which is also unique to Luke, of Martha and Mary. These are two sisters, and Jesus is in their home, and he'd been to their home a number of times. And Mary is sitting at his feet, listening to him, talking and visiting with him, and learning from him and paying attention. And Martha, the sister, is in the kitchen getting the meal together and all that. And she comes out and complains to Jesus that her sister's basically just sitting there, not helping her. And he says, Martha, Martha, what are you worried about? My time here is short. I'm going to be gone. You know, this is what you should be doing. You should be learning and enjoying. It's an interesting role for a woman in first century Palestine. You know, you really were more like property than you were as individuals. And they had earlier named, I skipped that part inadvertently, about the three women who were following Jesus, three of the names. So there were a group of women. It was Mary Magdalene and Joanna and Susanna. Now, and it says an interesting phrase, which I remembered for a long time. And they said, and they provided for themselves from their own resources. So I always thought, when you read this, that particularly Mary Magdalene, who was the most stable follower among the women, present at the crucifixion, present at the resurrection, principal witness to the resurrection, she probably was a wealthy widow who bankrolled him. Somebody had to be giving him cash of the small amount they needed to keep going. This myth that she was a prostitute is hogwash. All it says about her past is that Jesus cast out 7 demons. Well, we all got that many demons in us, that's for sure. And this prostitute thing was invented by people in the medieval time. So she was clearly the principal witness to the resurrection, but the women followed them around also. They traveled with them. I would suspect bankrolling them along the way. After that, you have the Lord's Prayer. The Lord teaches to pray. The Matthew version is traditionally what we use, not the Luke version here. And he follows that. Excuse me, I'm getting dry talking like this. With some phrases that we've gotten very used to and we use all the time. Ask and it will be given to you. Seek and you will find, Jesus says. And he's encouraging people to seek after the righteousness, to seek after the good values of life, to seek after faith, and it will be given to you. Then he's confronted by some of his adversaries who said, you're casting out demons in the mechanism of Beelzebub. Now, Beelzebub is a corruption of the name Baal. Baal was the Canaanite storm god, which was represented by a bull, i.e. the golden calf, the traditional Canaanite religious male figure. And Beelzebub, by this time, it had become a contamination of that name, and it was one of the myriad of devils in hell. The chief of the devils was Lucifer, which is an interesting name. It's the name of the bad cat in Cinderella. And you do have a brief mention of Satan here by name. So I was curious because there's nowhere in the Old Testament or the New Testament that describes Satan as a fallen angel. In Job, Satan was a member of the heavenly court. He was the adversary. He's the one who challenged God. God was saying how great a true follower Job is. And Satan said, yeah, sure, you've given him everything. He's got wealth, and he's got status, and he's got a great family, and everything's healthy and all that. Of course he's faithful to you. So where does this come that Satan was a fallen angel? It comes from the book of Enoch. Enoch is one of those books called the Pseudepigrapha, these extra writings between the Old Testament, which stopped about the book of Daniel about 300 BC, and the New Testament writings, which start with Paul's letters about 50 AD. A bunch of writings in that gap in there. And Enoch is quoted by people. It's not in the canon. It's not in the Old Testament, not in the New Testament. There never was serious consideration of putting it in the New Testament. But many of these legends that we have of Satan being a fallen angel, having led a revolt in heaven, all that, very much extrapolating human values over into the heavenly court. So I'm very suspicious of all this. I think it's convenient that we have these things, but I really don't think it makes a lot of sense either. Then Jesus makes a very good point that you're either for him or against him. And you can't be one way or the other. You got to be for him and against him. When he's asked for a sign, we've talked about this before, he says, the sign you're going to see is going to be the sign of Jonah. If you remember the details, Jonah is my favorite character in the Old Testament. He's the most human character. He's not heroic. He's not brave. He's not dynamic. The Lord tells him he wants to go here to Nineveh to preach, and he says, forget it, I'm running the other way. That's how he ends up on the boat, and they throw him in the water because they realize it's God cursing him. And he spends 3 days in the belly of the fish. Not a whale, doesn't say whale, it says fish. and then he's barfed up on the shore. So it precedes the 3 days in the tomb for Jesus at the time of the resurrection. So he's saying what you're going to see is the sign of Jonah coming back from 3 days in the netherworld. He's another time he's at a guest of a Pharisee's house, and he is criticized for not washing first, and his followers are criticized at various other times in the Gospels for not having washed their hands properly. Remember, there wasn't a lot of water in the Holy Land. There's a lot of water there now. It wasn't all that clean, but this was part of the ritual. And I've always thought these stories about not washing were really designed to show the Pharisees' problem, which can be a problem with any legalistic religion, of worshiping the law, worshiping the rules, rather than the Lord. Because you're supposed to worship the Lord, and if somebody can't or won't wash their hands, big deal. Rather than critiquing them for violating these routine rules, which were evolved along for convenience and reasonable, but they're not overwhelmingly, they don't describe your faith, they're just a rule. And this is a tough one. There's a lot of Protestant churches I've known that are extremely rule-oriented. You can't do this, you can't do that. And I'm not certain that really you can get distracted where you love the rules instead of the Lord. So faith isn't that important in that situation. And he said it's not what makes you dirty on the outside, it's what comes from inside you that makes you dirty. Lust and hate and envy and all those vile things. Then there's an odd passage in here, again, which is unique to Luke, about criticizing lawyers. Lawyers are not criticized in any of the other Gospels. And Luke, of course, was a Gentile from the Greek area, a companion of Paul, and it's the only mention of lawyers. So, and they're critiqued here, and I suspect that the few lawyers that were around in that time were used by the wealthy to abuse the poor. Remember, there's no middle class. There's haves and have-nots, and that's it. So I think the condemnation would be reasonable if, excuse me, my cat is up here on the table distracting us. It would be reasonable if, as a criticism, when they're only being used by the wealthy to abuse the poor. I kind of smile when I read it, remembering the quote from Shakespeare's Henry VI, Part 2, first let's kill all the lawyers. Now, I'm not one of these doctors that has all this antipathy to lawyers. For a number of years, I served as a consultant to the State Medical Board and Pharmacy Board, disciplining errant doctors, and I worked with a lot of lawyers, and these were very dedicated people to enforcing the law and cleaning up the problems that exist all the time in medical care. So I don't have that. I'm used to it, but it's unique. It's only in Luke, and I think it really comes from Luke's background, probably growing up in Greece, where there were, in better parts of the Roman Empire, wealthier parts, there probably were more lawyers, and they probably did abuse the poor. We have a lot of lawyers now who protect the poor, so I'm not complaining about it. I'm just amused by it because it's in there. And then Jesus makes the point that he will support those who support him, but not those that don't support. Well, okay, that sounds kind of tough. And he reiterates what I've been unable to decipher and discover. The only unforgivable sin is blasphemy against the Holy Spirit, and people have tried to explain it to me, and I'm too dense and too stupid to understand it, but I still don't understand what it really is. No one's ever been able to define it. Maybe if I get to there in the hereafter, I'll ask him to explain it to me. Then there's an interesting description of the folly of hoarding material goods. There's a story of a person who's having a prosperous farm, and his crops are coming in well, and he's thinking, well, maybe I'll tear my barn down to build a new barn, a much bigger barn, so I can continue to store more and more possessions. And you know, this is a trap we get into. We have a lot of times we get stuff just to have stuff. And that's really what it is, just stuff. And he says, basically implies the guy tears his barn down at night, and then the night is the time that he's going to move on. His life will end on this world, and he's got all the stuff he was going to prepare for his immediate earthly future becomes moot because he dies, and you don't know when that time is coming. So he makes the point, which is a very good point, about not getting obsessed with earthly treasures. And those earthly treasures can not only be material, they can be fame or impression of people, power, all those other things that are traps for us. And he does encourage almsgiving, donating to the poor, because the poor really need it. But he's very clear that you should do this quietly, that you should not do it and say, hey, see what a great person I am, I've given X amount. And this is tricky because it's easier to be generous if people praise you for it, but that's really not the proper almsgiving here. And you do find a lot of very wealthy people will make donations to colleges or whatever like that, and they'll get the medical school named after them, this and that. A lot of showing off there. And probably the one in my memory, they did the almsgiving properly, was Ray Kroc's widow, who gave a lot of money to various charities when there were floods up in South Dakota. She'd bail them out and stuff like that. And she didn't want any publicity. Finally, someone leaked who it was, and she was upset. That's the proper way to almsgive, rather than gloat about it and brag about it. There's the story about the servants always needing to be prepared when the master comes home, because if you're prepared and you've done what you're supposed to do and you're awake and alert and the master arrives, you're fine. Master's pleased with you. But if you've been lazy and slovenly and beating the other servants and taking advantage of it, and you're not paying attention, and suddenly the master arrives, again, this is warning about when your own life can come to an end, then you can be in big trouble. So, and then finally he wraps up with advice that if you're heading to court you're in a suit of some kind, either you're suing or the person suing you, try to make an accommodation on the way to court to avoid that kind of legal jurisdiction, because you can make an accommodation most of the time with these suits and avoid the animosity and the hostility and maybe the risk of potentially losing much more. So I've tried, we're going to stop, this is the end of the 6 chapters that we're going to do. I tried to make a point here about some of the unique stories. Good Samaritan is unique to Luke. Raising the widow of Nain's son is unique to Luke. Condemnation of the lawyers, which I'm not really into, is unique to Luke. So Luke's different Gentile background comes in and he puts in some very interesting stories. Remember at the beginning he explained what his sources were, that he went and talked to people who had known all these stories, who had lived all this time, and he incorporated their information. So we're going to stop here. The next lesson will be chapters 13 through, 6 chapters in 13, through 18, and then we'll finish up in 2 weeks. So that next week we'll do the next segment in Luke. This is Dr. Robert Guthrie. Thank you.